Chapter 6 of With Cortez in Mexico. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. With Cortez in Mexico by George Alfred Henty. Chapter 6, Anna Huek. It was now 6 months since Roger was wrecked on the coast of Tabasco. He spoke the native language with perfect fluency, and had learned all that was known as to the nations round Tabasco. Malinche was his chief source of information. She herself did not belong to the country, but, as she told Roger, to a tribe that had been conquered by far mightier people called Aztecs, who lived farther to the west. It was from them, she said, that the people of Tabasco obtained their gold, which was there very plentiful, and was thought but little of, as being useful only for ornaments, drinking cups, and similar purposes. They dwelt in a city named Mexico, standing in the midst of a lake. There were kindred peoples near them, and the country generally was called Anahuac. All were subject to the Aztecs, and their armies had gradually conquered all the surrounding peoples. They possessed great temples, compared to which those of Tabasco were as nothing. Their gods were very powerful, and all prisoners taken in war were sacrificed to them. They had rich mantles and clothing, and the Tabascans were but savages in comparison. Being asked how it was that she, who was a native of such a nation, came to be a slave among the Tabascans, she replied with tears that she had been sold. Her father had been a rich and powerful cazique of Panala, on the southeastern borders of the Mexican kingdom. He had died when she was very young, and her mother had married again and had a son. One night her mother had handed her over to some traders, by whom she had been carried away. She had learned from their conversation that her mother desired her son to inherit all her possessions, and that she had, therefore, sold her to these traders. The daughter of one of her slaves had died that evening, and she intended to give out that Malinche was dead, and to celebrate her funeral in the usual way. The traders had brought her to Tabasco, and sold her to the cazique of that town. "But this mother of yours must be an infamous woman, Malinche," Roger said indignantly, "thus to sell away her own daughter to be a slave." "Girls are not much good," Malinche said, sadly. "They cannot fight, and they cannot govern a people. It was natural that my mother should prefer her son to me, and should wish to see him a cazique when he grew up." Roger refused to see the matter in that light at all, and was indignant at Malinche for the forbearance that she showed in speaking of the author of her misfortunes. This conversation had taken place at the time when Roger had first learned to converse in the Tabascan language. The girl's statements with regard to the wealth of the country to which she belonged had fired his imagination. This was doubtless the country concerning which rumors were current among the Spanish islands, and with whom it had been the purpose of his father's expedition to open trade. Malinche told him that they spoke a language quite different from that of the Tabascans. There were many dialects among the various peoples under the sway of the Aztecs, but all could understand each other, as they had all come down from the far north to settle in the country. Thinking the matter over, he determined, if possible, that he would some day make his way over to Malinche's country, which seemed so far in advance of the Tabascans. "The Spaniards will go there some day," he said, "and although they would kill me without hesitation, if they found an Englishman there before them, I might yet in some way or other manage to achieve my escape." Accordingly, he asked Malinche to teach him her language, and at the end of the 6 months he could converse with her in it almost as readily as he could in Tabascan, for in learning it he had none of the initial difficulties he had at first encountered in acquiring Tabascan, the latter language serving as a medium. The year which had elapsed since the Swan sailed from Plymouth had effected great alteration in Roger's figure. He had grown several inches, and had widened out greatly, and was fulfilling the promise of his earlier figure by growing into an immensely large and powerful man. He was even now half a head taller than the very tallest of the natives of Tabasco, and in point of strength was still more their superior. Thus, although the belief in his supernatural origin was rapidly dying out, a certain respect for his size and strength prevented any of his opponents from any open exhibition of hostility. The fact, too, of his perfect fearlessness of demeanor added to this effect. Roger carried himself well, and as, with head erect, he strolled through the streets of Tabasco, with a step that contrasted strongly with the light and nimble one of the slenderly built natives, men made way for him, while his sunny hair, which fell in short waves back from his forehead, his fearless gray eyes, and the pleasant expression of his mouth, rendered him a source of admiration to the women, who, with scarce an exception, still believed firmly that he was no ordinary human being. One day, when Roger was dressing in the morning, he heard excited talking in the street, and the sound of hurrying feet. "What has happened this morning, Malinche?" he called out. "The merchants have come," she said. "The merchants from my country." As Roger had heard, from her, that a trade was carried on by Mexico with the surrounding countries, by merchants who traveled in parties with strong bodies of armed men, and that they had been at Tabasco but a few days only before he had first arrived there, and might be expected again in about a year, he was not surprised at the news. He had, indeed, been looking forward to this visit. He felt that his position was getting more and more unsafe, and that the cazique would not be able, much longer, to support him against the hostility of the majority of the men of importance in the town. What he had heard from Malinche had greatly raised his curiosity with regard to her country, and his longing to see these people, whom she described as invincible in war, and so infinitely superior in civilization to the Tabascans. He had closely inquired from Malinche whether she thought he would be well received, did he reach her country. Malinche's opinion was not encouraging. "I think," she said, "that they would sacrifice you in the temples. All our gods love sacrifices, and every year countless persons are offered up to them." "It is a horrible custom, Malinche." Malinche did not seem to be impressed, as he expected. "Why?" she asked. "They would be killed in battle were they not kept for sacrifice. The Aztecs never kill if they can help it, but take prisoners, so that death comes to them in one way instead of another. And it is better to be killed in the service of the gods than to fall uselessly in battle." "I don't think so at all, Malinche. In battle one's blood's up, and one scarcely feels pain. And if one is killed, and there is an end of it. That is quite different to being put to death in cold blood." "And do they sacrifice women as well as men?" "Sometimes, but not so many," she said. "And in dry weather they offer up children to Taluk, the god of rain." "But they cannot capture them in war," Roger said, horrified. "No, they are sold by their parents, who have large families and can do without one or two." To Malinche, brought up in the hideous religion of the Mexicans, these things appeared as a matter of course, and she could scarcely understand the horror and disgust which her description of the sacrifices to her gods caused him. "And you think that they would sacrifice me, Malinche?" "I cannot say," she replied. The priests are masters in these things. If they said sacrifice, they would sacrifice you. But if they thought you a god, you would be treated with great honor. How can I tell? I think that they would pay you greater honor than here, but of course I cannot tell." "Why should they pay me greater honor, Malinche?" "Because one of our gods was white. Quetzalcoatl was the kindest of our gods. He taught us the use of metals, instructed us how to till the ground, and laid down all the rules for good government. When he lived in Anahuac, everyone was happy. Every head of corn was so big that a man could scarce carry one. The earth was full of flowers and fruit. Cotton grew of many colors, so that there was no need to dye it, and the very birds sang more sweetly than they have ever sung since. Ah! If Quetzalcoatl had always stopped with us, we should have been happy indeed." "But why did he not, Malinche?" Malinche shook her head. "He was a god, but not one of the greatest, and one of these grew angry with him. I cannot tell who. Perhaps it was the god of war, who saw that the Anahuans were so happy that they no longer went out to conquer other people and to provide sacrifices for him. Perhaps they were jealous, because the people worshipped Quetzalcoatl more than them. Anyhow, they were angry with him, and he was obliged to leave us. He came down to the sea and took leave of the people, promising that he or his descendants would some day revisit them. Then he took his seat in his boat, which was formed of serpent skins, and sailed away, and has never been seen again. But we all know that one day, if he does not come himself, white people will come from the sea to us. I think, Roger, that you are one of the descendants of Quetzalcoatl, and I think my countrymen would think so too, and would hold you in great honor if the priests, who are very powerful, did not turn them against you." "What was this god like?" asked Roger. "He was tall in stature, and he had a white skin, and his hair was not like yours, for it was long and dark, and flowed over his shoulders, and he had a great beard. But as you are tall and white, you are like him, and as he went towards the rising sun, it may be that, afterwards, his hair changed from black to a color like yours, which seems to me brown when you are sitting here, but gold when the sun falls on it. So it seems, Malinche, that I may be sacrificed, or I may be taken for a god. I would much rather that they would be content to treat me for what I am, a man like themselves, only of a different race and color." Roger had many conversations of this kind with Malinche, and as he felt his position becoming daily more precarious among the Tabascans, had come to believe that he should have at least as good a chance among the Aztecs as where he was. In return for all the girl told him about her country, he told her much about his own. He explained to her that there were many peoples among the whites, as among the reds, and they fought against each other in battle, having weapons which made a noise like thunder, and killed at a great distance. He told her how one of these peoples, named Spaniards, had conquered many islands not very far distant from Tabasco, and how assuredly they would come, in time, and try to conquer this country too. He explained that, while the nation to which he belonged was, at present, at peace with the Spaniards, they were not allowed to come into this part of the world, and that had he and those who had sailed with him fallen into their hands, they would have been all put to death. The news, then, that the Aztec traders had arrived was a matter as of much interest to Roger as to the people of the town. These looked forward to purchasing many things which they could not otherwise obtain, for the gold ornaments, the rich feather mantles, and most of the other articles of superior manufacture which Roger had seen were not the work of the natives of Tabasco, but of their powerful neighbors. The traders would stay, Malinche said, for 4 or 5 days at least, and Roger, therefore, thought it better not to go out to see them until he learned what were the cazique's views concerning him. He therefore remained quietly at home all day. Upon the following morning he received a summons from the cazique. "White man," the chief said, "I have spoken to the Anahuac traders concerning you, and they have a great desire to see you. Therefore you will, this morning, accompany us to their camp." An hour afterwards Roger started with the cazique and a numerous body of the latter's counselors and attendants. The encampment of the Anahuans was a quarter of a mile from the town. In the center rose a large tent, the abode of the merchants, and around, ranged in regular order, were the rough huts erected by their escort. These were assembled in military array. They were, like the Tabascan soldiers, clad in thick quilted doublets. Their spears were tipped with copper or with obsidian, a stone resembling flint, of great hardness and capable of taking a very sharp edge. In front of the tent were several banners, embroidered in different devices in gold and feather work. Roger afterwards learned that merchants were held in far higher consideration in Anahuac than in Europe, that their business was considered as one of great honor, and that they were permitted to assume what may be called heraldic devices on their standards, to carry bright feathered plumes, and to wear gold ornaments, such decorations being only allowed to warriors who had, by their deeds in battle, been admitted into an institution which closely resembled that of knighthood, all others dressing in plain white clothes, woven from thread obtained from the aloe. Even members of the royal family were not exempted from this law. The whole trade of the country was in the hands of these merchants, who traded not only to its utmost borders, but with neighboring people. They were allowed to raise forces sufficient for their protection. They furnished the government with descriptions of the people they visited, and often afforded the state a pretext for wars and annexations by getting up quarrels with the natives. They resembled, in fact, the East India Company during the last century, mingling in their persons the military and mercantile character. In addition to their soldier escort, they took with them on their journeys a vast number of slaves. These carried the merchandise, made up into packets weighing about 80 pounds. Many of these slaves had been instructed in the arts of the Aztecs, and there were among them musicians, singers, dancers, and workers in metal and feather work, and these were sold at high rates to the people with whom they traded. The merchants, who were attired in rich feather mantles, with plumes of bright feathers upon their heads, came to the entrance of their tent when the cazique, with his company, approached. After some talk between them and the chief, by means of an interpreter, Roger was brought forward from the rear of the company. The merchants inspected him with grave curiosity. They turned and talked among themselves. Then they invited the chief to enter their tent. He remained there for some time, and when he came out again, returned to his companions, and, ordering 4 of his soldiers to accompany him back to the town, left the rest of his party to traffic as they chose with the merchants. He did not address Roger until they reached his house, and then bade him enter with him. "White man," he said, "the Anahuan merchants wish to carry you away with them to their own country, and have offered in exchange sundry slaves and articles of merchandise. I would not have parted with you, and have told them, indeed, that you were no slave of mine to sell as I chose, but a stranger who had come to visit me from I know not where, and have also told them that, if you go with them, it must be of your own free choice, for that misfortune might fall upon my people did I treat you with aught but honor. It is then for you to decide. You know that I wish well to you, and hold you in great esteem, deeming that your visit here will give prosperity as well as honor to Tabasco. But there are those among my people who are foolish and headstrong, and who view your coming with suspicion. The priests, too, are unfavorably disposed toward you, and have long urged that you would make a most acceptable sacrifice to the gods. So far I have withstood them, but I am old and cannot look to live long, and after I have gone, your enemies would assuredly have their way. Therefore I think it is for your good that you should go with these merchants." The cazique was speaking the truth, but not the whole truth. The merchants had offered, in slaves and goods, an amount which had excited his cupidity, and he was, moreover, glad to be rid of the presence of one who was the cause of constant dispute and trouble in his councils. At the same time, he still believed in the supernatural powers of his visitor, and was afraid that, if the latter went against his will, he might invoke all sorts of ills and misfortunes upon Tabasco. He was much relieved then, when Roger replied that he was willing to go with the merchants. "I have seen," he said, "that my presence here is unwelcome to many, and that I was the cause of trouble. I know, too, cazique, that you have befriended me to the utmost, while many others have been against me. I am willing, then, to depart." Great was the grief of Malinche when she learned from Roger that he was to go with the Anahuans. "Could not my lord take me with him?" she asked presently, as her sobs lessened in violence. "I shall be but a slave myself, Malinche. If you ask the cazique, he will let me go with you. I am but of little value to him." Roger did not answer for some minutes. He would have been glad, indeed, to have had Malinche, who had been his companion and friend, and whom he regarded almost as a sister, with him, but there were many things to be considered. He might be well received in this new country, but he might be sacrificed to these gods of theirs, and in that case Malinche might share his fate, as she said that even women were offered up. Even if well received, he might not be able to have Malinche with him. Besides, of course, he did not want her as an attendant, and in what other capacity could she go? If he got into trouble, and had to try to escape from their land, he might not be able to carry her off, too. If they were separated, what was to become of her? She could not go to the mother who had sold her as a slave. No, certainly, he decided, he must go without her. "Malinche," he said, after a long silence, "it cannot be. There is no saying what my fate may be among your people. I may be offered up to those terrible gods you told me of. I may be treated as a slave. There is no saying what might happen. At any rate, I shall be unable to afford you any protection. Were we separated, as it is almost certain we should be, where could you go, or what would become of you? Besides, how in any case could we keep together? I could not have you as a slave, even if I wanted to do so, in your own country. And how else could you go with me? If you like, I will ask the cazique for your freedom, so that you might travel back to your own country with the merchants." The girl shook her head. "I have no friends there now," she said. "Where should I go?" "That is just what I am saying, Malinche. There is nowhere for you to go except with me, and I do not see how you could go with me. If you do not like this, I will promise you that, if things turn out well with me in your country, I will send by the next merchants who come here, and buy you from the cazique, and find friends for you there, and place you with them." "You would have wives there," the girl said passionately, "and you would never think any more of me." Roger burst into a loud laugh. "Why, Malinche, I am only a boy. I am not yet 18, and in my country we do not think of taking wives until we are 8 or 10 years older than that. It is a serious thing with us, for each man has only one wife, and it behooves him, therefore, to be very careful in making his choice. I hope, long before it comes to my time for thinking of marriage, to be back in my own country and among my own people. If I were to marry here, how could I ever think of going away? I could not go and leave a wife behind me. I could not take her away with me, because she would never be happy among a strange people, any more than I should be happy if I lived here." "No, no, Malinche, there is no fear of my marrying, any more than there is of my forgetting you. You can trust me. If I live and do well in your country, I will send for you, and I will tell your people that you have been as a sister to me, and will see that this mother of yours does you justice, and that you shall come to your own again, and you shall marry some cazique of your own choice. If you do not hear from me, you will know that things have gone badly with me, and that either I have been sacrificed to your gods, or that I am held as a slave and have no power whatever to help you." Malinche said no more. Her dark eyes were full of tears, but with a habit of submission natural to Mexican women, she simply took Roger's hand and placed it against her forehead. "Malinche will wait," she said, and then hurried from the room. Before leaving, Roger gave Malinche several of the handsomest of the bracelets and necklaces that had been bestowed on him in the first flush of his popularity at Tabasco, and gave presents also to the old woman. The two girls wept bitterly when he said goodbye to them, and Roger himself had to fight hard to restrain his tears. "It is as bad," he said to himself, "as it was saying goodbye to Dorothy and Agnes. Color does not matter much, after all. Malinche is just as good and kind as if she were white." The cazique himself conducted Roger to the Anahuac encampment. He had that morning made him various presents of robes and mantles, for he was very desirous that his visitor should part in good will from him, and he again impressed upon him the fact that he only parted with him because he felt that he could not protect him from the ill will of some of his people. The merchants made no secret of their satisfaction as soon as they handed to the cazique the goods and slaves they had agreed to give in exchange for Roger. They had, like the cazique, pretended to be indifferent as to the bargain, and had haggled with him over the terms of the purchase. But both parties were equally desirous of concluding the agreement, and, while the cazique considered that he was making an excellent bargain for the visitor, who had voluntarily placed himself in his hands, the merchants were still more delighted. In the first place, the Mexicans were, as Malinche had told Roger, looking for the arrival of Quetzalcoatl, or of a white descendant of his from the sea. And if Roger were to turn out to be the expected god, the honor which would fall upon them, as his producer, would be great, indeed. But even should this not prove so, they would gain great credit, to say nothing of profit, by bringing home so singular a being, who would either be received in high honor by the king, or would be one of the most acceptable sacrifices ever offered to the gods. As soon, therefore, as the cazique had left, they addressed Roger in terms of high respect, and presented to him some of their most handsome feather robes, tiaras with plumes, ornaments, and arms. To their stupefaction, Roger replied in their own language, and as they were in ignorance that the cazique possessed a countrywoman of their own among his slaves, they regarded this as a miracle of the most singular kind, and as an indisputable proof of the supernatural nature of their visitant. It was true that he did not speak as a native, but Quetzalcoatl himself might well have forgotten somewhat of his own language in his hundreds of years of absence from Mexico. The large tent was at once placed at Roger's disposal, the merchants contenting themselves with a smaller one raised beside it. A number of slaves were told off to attend upon him, and his meals were served with the greatest ceremony and deference. That night, as Roger lay upon the soft pile of quilted rugs prepared for him, his mind was sorely troubled as to his position. Was he right in allowing them to deceive themselves into a belief that he was a supernatural being? Ought he not, rather, to tell them that all these gods they worshipped were false, and that there was but one true God, he who was worshipped by the white men? Thinking it over in every way, he concluded at last that there was no necessity for him at present to undeceive the Anahuans. He could do no good by doing so, and would ensure his own destruction. He resolved, however, that nothing should induce him to pay honor to their gods, or to take any part in their bloody sacrifices. "They can kill me if they will," he said, "but I am not going to be false to my religion. If they should not kill me, I may be able, in time, to persuade them that their gods are false. But for the present it would be madness to try to do so. From what Malinche said, they are devoted to their religion, and the priests are all powerful. If I am to do any good, therefore, it must be done gradually. What should we think at home if an Indian were to arrive and to try and teach us that our God was a false one? Why, he would be burnt at the stake in no time. And one cannot expect that these Indians would be more patient in such a matter than we should. When the Spaniards come, they will doubtless overthrow their gods and force them to be Christians, just as they have with the peoples in the islands." The next morning early the tents were pulled down, the slaves loaded up with what merchandise remained unsold, with the tents and provisions for the journey, and the caravan started for the west. A party of the soldiers marched first. Then came the merchants, with Roger and a small guard of armed men. They were followed by the slaves, and another body of troops brought up the rear. For 6 days they passed through a country more or less cultivated, with villages scattered about. One of these was always chosen for their stopping place, and Roger admired the regularity and order with which the encampment was formed, and the good conduct observed in the dealings with the people. Provisions were obtained by barter, and the inhabitants mingled fearlessly with the trading party. He remarked on this to the merchants, who replied that it was always their custom to keep on the most friendly terms with the people. "Our caravans," they said, "visit all the countries round our own, and did one of them ill-treat the natives, the others would suffer for it. Therefore we are always particular to give them no cause for dissatisfaction. The empire is extensive, and many parts of it are but newly conquered. Therefore we should be gravely blamed were we to embroil ourselves with its neighbors, until the king desired to carry his arms in that direction. Sometimes we have trouble. We were with a party who, a few years back, were attacked of the people of Ayotlan. We saw that trouble was coming, and fortified our camp, and for 4 years carried on war with the town, and in the end captured it. But this was forced upon us, and we had the approval of the king. All those concerned in the struggle were permitted to have banners of their own, and military emblems." "How did you supply yourselves with provisions all the time?" "The country people were neutral. That was the advantage we had from having always treated them well, while the cazique of Ayotlan had been a tyrant, and had greatly oppressed them. So they brought in provisions to us for sale, and we had less difficulty in that way than the people of the town." At last the villages of the Tabascans were left behind. For some days the caravans traveled through a very sparsely populated country, and then arrived at a large village where the Anahuac language was spoken. "We are now in the country of the king," the principal merchant said. "All over it you will find the same language spoken, for although there are many people who lived under their own chiefs, and many of whom have been but lately conquered, the language is similar, though spoken with differences, for all the tribes came down from the north and settled here." "And who dwelt here before they came?" "A people called the Toltecs. They were a great people, well instructed in agriculture, great workers in metals, and builders of grand cities." "And what became of them?" "It is not known, but misfortunes came upon them, famine or disease, and it is said that they went away to the south. Then came a people called the Chichemecs, a barbarous people from the north, whom we found here when we came. Of us, the greatest tribe were the Aztecs, who settled on one side of the Great Lake and built a city there called Tenochtitlan, or sometimes Mexico, from the great war god Mexitli. Another great tribe were the Tezcucans, to which we belong, and our capital is Tezcuco, on the eastern side of the same lake. Mexico and Tezcuco formed an alliance, and with us was Tlacopan, a smaller kingdom hard by. It was agreed that in all wars 1/5 of the spoil should go to the Tlacopans, and the rest be divided between the Aztecs and the Tezcucans. This alliance has remained unbroken, and together we have conquered all the countries round, and from sea to sea." "What sea?" Roger interrupted. "There is, on the west, another great sea like this on the east, which stretches away no man knows whither; and between these two seas all the peoples, save one, acknowledge the dominion of Mexico. For although we are in alliance, the Aztecs have of late years taken the lead, for they have had very great monarchs, and are more war-loving than we of Tezcuco; and our kings, and those of Tlacopan, acknowledge the Aztecs to be the leading power, and give to their king the title of emperor. We maintain our own laws and usages. Our king places the crown upon the head of each new monarch of Mexico, but we own him to be the chief of our confederacy, and the more distant countries, that have but recently been conquered, have been assigned entirely to the Aztecs, although we have had our proper share in the slaves and spoil taken in the war." "And what is the one state that has not been conquered by your confederacy?" "Tlascala. It lies high up among the mountains and, although but a small state, has maintained its independence, and has several times repulsed the attacks of our best soldiers." Roger thought that Tlascala must be a sort of Mexican Switzerland. "It is singular that a small state should have resisted so long," he said. "They have not been very often attacked," the merchant replied. "There is little to be got from them but hard knocks. The country is not fertile, the cold is too great, and they have only the necessities of life. Except for slaves, and for sacrifice to the gods, there is nothing to be gained by their conquest." "And you all worship the same gods?" Roger asked. "Assuredly," he said, "although some are thought more highly of in one kingdom, some in another. Mexitli, or as he is generally called, Huitzilopochtli, is of course the greatest everywhere, but he is worshipped most of all by the Aztecs. Quetzalcoatl is also greatly worshipped." As he spoke, the merchant glanced furtively up at Roger. The lad saw that this was a favorable opportunity for creating an impression. He smiled quietly. "It is right that he should be," he said, "since he taught you all the good things you know, and was, like myself, white." This proof of the great knowledge possessed by the being before him vastly impressed the Mexican. How could this strange being know the Mexican tongue, and be acquainted with its gods, unless he were one of them? It had pleased him to assume ignorance of other matters, but doubtless he was well aware of everything that had passed in the country since he left it. Henceforth the respect which he and his companions paid to Roger was redoubled. As soon as they had reached the borders of Mexico, a swift runner had been dispatched to the nearest post with a message to be sent forward to the king of Tezcuco, with the tidings of the arrival of a strange white being in the land, and asking for instructions as to what was to be done with him. In the meantime, the merchants told Roger that they wished him to abstain from going out into the various villages and towns at which they stopped. "Until we know what are the king's wishes concerning you, it were better that you were not seen. In the first place, all this country by the coast is under the Aztec rule, and as soon as you were seen, messages would be sent forward to Mexico, and the emperor might desire that so great a wonder should be sent directly to him. Whereas, if our own king sends first for you, you would be his property, as it were, and even Montezuma would not interfere. It will not be long before an answer arrives, for along all the roads there are post houses, 2 leagues apart from each other. At each of these, couriers are stationed, men trained to run at great speed, and these carry the dispatches from post to post, at the rate of 8 or 9 miles an hour. But the messages must get changed where they have to be given so often. Not at all, he said. The couriers know nothing of the dispatches they carry. Oh, they are written dispatches, Roger said. Then you possess the art of writing. Writing? What is writing? The merchant asked. Letters are inscribed on paper, Roger said, so that the person receiving them at a distance understands exactly what the one who wrote wished to say. The merchant shook his head. I know nothing of what you call letters, he said. We draw pictures on a fabric formed of prepared skins, or of a composition of silk and gum, but chiefly on a paper prepared from the leaves of the aloe. Besides the pictures there are marks, which are understood to represent certain things. These picture dispatches are made in the form of rolls or books. I myself has a slave who is skilled in such work, and who has depicted you and added all particulars, and the roll has been forwarded to Tezcuco. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of With Cortez in Mexico. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. With Cortez in Mexico by George Alfred Henty. Chapter 7, A Wonderful Country. So anxious were the merchants to avoid arriving at any town of importance where there would be an Aztec commander and garrison, until they received an answer from Tezcuco, that they traveled by very slow stages, camping in small villages where they could obtain water and supplies. Roger asked many questions of them as to the country, and learned that the hot and arid soil they were now crossing extended only about 1/3 of the distance to be traversed. Then that they would pass over a range of lofty mountains, offering great difficulties to travel, that the cold was extreme, and that snow lay almost continuously upon the highest summits. After crossing this range, they would journey across a rich country, and descend at last into a most lovely and fertile valley, in which lay the lake, upon which the capitals of the 2 countries were situated. The country they were now traversing varied considerably. In some places it consisted of parched and sandy plains, almost free of vegetation. In others, where the rains were less able to drain quickly away, were districts of extraordinary fertility. Here grew the cocoa, vanilla, indigo, and aromatic shrubs innumerable, forming thick and tangled jungles, impervious to the foot of man. Flowers of gorgeous colors bordered these groves, and lofty trees of foliage, altogether strange to Roger, reared their heads above them. The lad was delighted with the extraordinary richness of color, and the variety of the foliage, but he would have enjoyed it more had it not been for the intense heat of the sun and the closeness of the air. They crossed several large streams. They cut down the great rushes which bordered them, and, tying these together in bundles, formed rafts, upon which 4 or 5 at a time were ferried over. Roger learned that the principal road from the coast ran from Campoala, a large town near the sea, but that this lay a long distance to the north, and that the route they were traveling ran nearly due west to Tepeaca, and thence northwest to Pueblo, after which the towns lay thickly all the way to the lake. As far as Roger could learn the distance, from the coast which they had lately been following to Mexico, was by this route about 300 miles. On the 5th day after the messenger had been dispatched, a courier ran into the camp just as the caravan was about to start, and handed to the chief merchant what looked to Roger like a portfolio. This indeed was something of its character. It consisted of 2 thin boards, within which was a sheet of paper. It contained a number of paintings and signs, of which Roger could make nothing, but the merchants informed him that it expressed the satisfaction of the king of Tezcuco at the news that had been sent him of the arrival of a strange white personage in the land, that the priests would consult the auguries and decide whether it boded well or ill for the country, and in the meantime that they were to journey on to Tepeaca, where they would be met by an envoy, charged to receive the white stranger and to conduct him to Tezcuco. The merchants themselves were only able to gather the general contents of this picture dispatch, but the slave who had drawn the one sent forward interpreted every sign and color, for Roger found that colors as well as signs had their meaning. He learned from the merchants that this picture writing was a science in itself, and that it needed years of instruction and labor to acquire it. In every town and village there were certain persons skilled in the art, so that messages of all kinds could be sent to the capital, and orders and instructions received. The national archives were entirely written in this manner, and in the temples were immense stores of these documents, affording information of every event of interest, however minute, in the history of the people. The caravan now pushed on rapidly. After traveling, as Roger calculated, nearly 100 miles from the sea, the ground began to rise rapidly, and in a single day the change in temperature was very marked. Roger felt the sense of listlessness and oppression, which had weighed upon him while crossing the low country, pass away as if by magic, and it seemed to him that he was again breathing the air of Devonshire. The vegetation had greatly changed. The vanilla, cocoa, and indigo had disappeared, and trees totally different from those of the plain met his eye. Another day's march, and they were 4,000 feet above the sea. Here everything was green and bright, showing that rain constantly fell. Groves of a tree of rich foliage, which was, the merchant told him, the liquid amber tree, grew near the road, while on both sides lofty mountains rose precipitously to a great height, their summits being clothed in snow. Some of these, he heard, had in times past burnt with terrible fires, and vast quantities of melted rock flowed over the country, carrying destruction in its course. In many cases the road was a mere track, winding along the side of these mountains, with precipices yawning below. A day's march through the mountains brought them into a lofty plateau, some 7,000 feet above the sea. Here were wide-spreading forests of trees, which Roger recognized as large oaks and cypress. Around the villages were clearings, and whereas in the plains below maize was chiefly cultivated, the largest proportion of the fields here were devoted to plantations of the aloe or maguey. Here, even at midday, the temperature was not too hot to be pleasant, while at night the cold was great, and Roger was glad to pile the thick quilted rugs over him. After traversing this plateau for some distance, they came upon another range of hills, far loftier than those they had before crossed, and vastly higher than anything Roger had ever before beheld in his travels. These mountains were, the merchant told him, the Cordilleras. They extended from unknown regions in the north through Anahuac to the south. The snow never melted upon the summits, and several of the highest of these were terrible volcanoes, whose eruptions were dreaded by the whole nation. Sometimes before these commenced, the merchant said, the earth trembled and shook, so that men could scarce stand upon it. Houses were thrown down, and terrible destruction of life and property took place. Fortunately, these are rare occurrences, but several of them have taken place since the time when the Aztecs first established themselves here. The passage through this range was attended with real hardship. Roger, accustomed to our English winter only in the mild climate of South Devonshire, felt the cold to be severe. But the natives suffered far more, and the merchants continued their march right through one night, for the labor of carrying their burdens kept the blood of the thinly clad slaves in motion, whereas if they had halted, many would have succumbed to the cold. At last the path began to descend, and soon after daybreak, as the road crossed a shoulder of the hill, they saw a plateau similar to that they had left, stretching out below them as far as the eye could reach. Even at the height at which they were standing, Roger could see that it was densely populated. Villages were scattered thickly, and the forest was restricted to patches, here and there, the greater portion of the land being under cultivation. Directly in front rose the lofty buildings and temples of a town of considerable size. Seen through the clear mountain air, it seemed but 3 or 4 miles away, and Roger had difficulty in believing the merchants when they assured him that it was fully 20. This was Tepeaca. The slaves, wearied as they were, quickened in their pace, and in 2 hours they emerged from the mountain gorges onto the temperate plateau. Here they halted for some hours near a post house, a courier being sent on to Tepeaca to inform the king's envoys that they had arrived thus far, and to ask whether they should proceed at noon, when the slaves had rested, or make their entry into the town in the morning. In a little over 4 hours the answer was received. The merchants were directed to wait where they were until 3 hours after noon, then to move forward until they arrived within 8 miles of the town, and then to halt for the night, and to start again at sunrise next morning. Roger was as glad as were the slaves that he had not another 15 miles march before him, for the journey had been a most fatiguing one. He thought that the absolute distance traversed did not exceed 30 miles, but owing to the difficulties of the road, and the care that had to be taken in traversing it at night, even with the assistance of the torches carried by the soldiers of the caravan, it had taken them 20 hours, including occasional halts, to perform the journey. An abundance of food was brought in by the neighboring villagers, and the merchants issued an extra supply of cocoa to the slaves; and when the march was resumed, late in the afternoon, the latter had completely recovered from their fatigue. After a march of little more than 2 hours' duration, the caravan halted for the night, and resumed its journey at daybreak. The merchants had presented Roger with a mantle, more highly decorated than that which he had before worn, and with some rich plumes of feathers for his head; and seeing that they wished him to make as brave a show as possible, he put on some of the gold necklaces and bracelets he had received at Tabasco. The caravan was formed up in military order, the standards of the traders being displayed at the head of the column. The porters were placed 4 abreast, and the soldiers who marched on either side were ordered to see that they kept their ranks. The merchants had put on their handsomest mantles, and everything was done to show off the procession to the best. As they approached Tepeaca, the road was lined with people, the news of the approach of the wonderful white man having spread rapidly. As Roger passed, they bowed to the ground, with the same respect that they paid to their own chiefs. He fully came up to their expectations, for not only was the whiteness of his skin and the color of his hair wonderful to them, but he stood many inches higher than the merchants who walked by his side. For Roger had now attained his full height, although but a few months past 17, and stood 6 feet 2 in the thin sandals that he wore. He was, as yet, far from the width that he would attain in another 5 or 6 years, but looked broad and massive as compared with the slight frames of the Mexicans. When within a quarter of a mile of the gates of the town, a procession was seen approaching from it. At its head were 2 nobles, whose appearance far exceeded anything Roger had hitherto seen. They wore cuirasses formed of thin plates of gold, and over these mantles of gorgeous feather work. On the head of one was a helmet of wood, fashioned to represent the head of the puma, or Mexican lion. The other wore a helmet of silver, above which was a cluster of variegated feathers sprinkled with precious stones. They wore heavy collars, bracelets, and earrings of gold and precious stones. Beside them were borne their banners, richly embroidered with gold and feather work, while behind them were a body of soldiers in close vests of quilted cotton, and a train of slaves. The merchants bowed low as the nobles approached. The latter paused for a moment as they came near to Roger, and then saluted him by touching the ground with their hands, and then carrying them to their heads. Roger did the same. In the meantime, several attendants round the nobles were filling the air with incense from censers which they bore. "The King of Tezcuco has sent us to welcome you," one of the nobles said. "He longs to see the white stranger who has arrived in our land." "I have heard of the greatness of the king," Roger replied, "and desire to look upon him. I have come from a great distance beyond the sea to see for myself the greatness of the Anahuac kingdoms, and am glad to meet 2 of its great nobles." The Mexicans were not surprised at Roger understanding their language and replying in it, for the dispatches had already acquainted the king with the fact that the white stranger could converse in their language. There had been an animated debate at the royal council at Tezcuco when the news of his coming had arrived. Some were of opinion that it was an evil omen, for there was a prophecy existing among them that white strangers would come from beyond the seas and overthrow the Aztec power. But upon the other hand, it was pointed out that this could only refer to a large body of men, and that as this stranger came alone, it was far more probable that he was either Quetzalcoatl himself or one of his descendants, and that he came in a spirit of goodwill. If he were a man, one man could do nothing to shake the Aztec power. If he were a god, he could work evil to the whole country, whether he remained on the seashore or advanced to the capital, and it was far better to propitiate him with gifts than to anger him with opposition. Some slaves next brought forward some delicately wrought mats, and laid upon them the various articles they had brought: a shield, helmet, and a cuirass, all with embossed plates and ornaments of gold, a collar and bracelets of the same metal, sandals and fans, crests of variegated feathers, intermingled with gold and silk thread, sprinkled with pearls and precious stones, imitations of birds and animals in cast and wrought gold and silver, of exquisite workmanship, curtains, coverlets, and robes of cotton as fine as silk, of rich and various colors, interwoven with feather work so finely wrought that it resembled the delicacy of painting. Roger was astonished at the richness and variety of these goods, and as he viewed them muttered to himself, "If I were but back in Plymouth with these, my cousin Mercy and Dorothy and Agnes would open their eyes indeed. I wish to goodness I had something to send back to the king. One of the cannon from the Swan, with a supply of ammunition and bullets, would have astonished him. However, as it is, I suppose that I must make the best of it." When the goods were all displayed, Roger addressed the ambassadors, saying how great was the pleasure that the gifts afforded him. Not, he said, because he desired gold or jewels or articles of luxury, but because they were proofs of the goodwill of the king, and of the mightiness of his power. Will you convey my earnest thanks to him for these presents, and say that I regret deeply that I have come to his country empty-handed, and have not to send him in return, but that there are reasons why I could not bring aught with me from the place far across the seas from which I came? There are many strange and wonderful things there. People move across the water in floating castles as big as your temples. They ride on great animals, which carry them with the speed of the wind. When they fight, they use weapons which 20 men could not lift, which make a noise like thunder, and destroy their foes at 2 or 3 miles distance. But I was not permitted to bring, at present, any of these wonders from the far distant country. I wanted to come myself, and I have come. But, as I have said, I had to come alone and empty-handed. In time, these wonderful things will be brought to your shores, but the time has not yet come." The nobles listened with respectful attention. It seemed to them probable enough that a supernatural personage might convoy himself vast distances through the air, but that he could not burden himself with mortal appliances, if indeed such things were the work of merely mortal men. "I could bring with me," Roger went on, "but one small specimen of the metal most used in that distant country." Then the merchants advanced and handed to Roger his knife, which they had purchased of the cazique of Tabasco, in exchange for 2 accomplished slaves, and he presented it to the nobles. "You see, it is a metal of extraordinary hardness. Swords made of it will cut through a man's head to the chin. No arrows or spears will penetrate armor made of it. It can be beaten into all shapes when hot. The weapons of which I spoke to you are constructed of it, and it is now used in the arts, in manufacture, and for domestic purposes, as well as for armor and weapons. So common is it that, as you see, the handle is made only of rough horn, which shows you that it is such a one as is commonly used, and is prized but little. It may be that such a metal is found in your country, though as yet you know it not, for in its natural state it is but a stone like others, although greater in weight, and if so, I may be permitted some day to instruct you in the methods of working it." The nobles were greatly impressed with this speech. Quetzalcoatl had instructed the Mexicans in all the arts that they possessed, and this hint that their visitor might bestow upon them the knowledge of this new and most valuable metal seemed a fresh proof of his relationship to the white god, whose return had been so long expected and longed for. They now begged him to enter the city, and a party of their slaves took up the gifts and ranged themselves behind him. The Mexican troops fell in on either side and prevented the crowd from pressing in upon them, and then, accompanied by the 2 nobles, and followed immediately by the merchants, Roger headed the procession as it again set forward. As he entered the town, Roger saw that it was vastly in advance of Tabasco. The walls were of stone, strong and massive. The streets were wide and straight, bordered by well-built houses with flat roofs, upon which great numbers of people were assembled. These uttered cries of welcome as he came along, and threw down wreaths of flowers. The Aztec governor, with a strong guard of soldiers, met them in a large square in the center of the town, and in the name of the Emperor Montezuma welcomed Roger, and presented him with gifts of even greater value than those sent by the King of Tezcuco, saying that his master hoped that he would pay a visit to his capital, as well as to that of the neighboring sovereign. Roger replied suitably, and the procession then took its way to a large house that had been assigned to the visitor. Here a banquet was served in grand style, the governor and the 2 ambassadors alone taking their seats with him. The meal was served up on golden dishes, and pulque was handed round in goblets of the same metal by white-robed slaves. Strains of music rose in the air. the performers being stationed in an adjoining apartment. The music was unlike anything Roger had ever before heard, and seemed to him to be of a plaintive nature. With the exception of the fruits, the dishes served were all strange to him, and he was unable even to guess at their nature. Among them was a large bird, which Roger judged to be either a swan or a peacock, but which he was informed was a turkey, a bird common in the country, but of which he had never before heard. There were other sorts of game, and all these were prepared with delicate sauces and seasonings. There were a large number of various confections and pastry, and a great variety of vegetables and fruits. Under the dishes of meats, small fires of charcoal were burning in order to keep them hot. The table was ornamented with vases of silver and gold, of delicate workmanship, and the confections were eaten with spoons made of gold or silver, or of tortoise shell. Several varieties of pulque, flavored with sweets and acids, were handed, as also chocolate flavored with vanilla and other spices. When the viands were removed, slaves brought round, as they had done before the meal began, basins of water and soft cotton towels, and each of those present washed his hands and face. Then a surprise even greater than those which had preceded it awaited Roger. 2 attendants brought round waiters, upon one of which was placed a pile of a substance which looked to Roger as if it were the leaves of some vegetable broken into small pieces, and also a gold box containing a brown dust. On the other tray were placed a variety of instruments, of whose use Roger was ignorant. They were small tubes, inserted into bowls of gold or silver, and in addition to these were some things that looked like yellowish brown sticks, of 2 or 3 inches in length, with tubes into which they fitted. These trays were first handed to Roger, who, after examining their contents, turned to the noble next to him and said, "I know not what these may be, or how they are used. They are not in use in the country from which I come." The noble looked surprised. "It is yetl," he said, "and is good for soothing the nerves and preparing for the siesta, besides being very pleasant. All these things are made from the same leaf," and he touched the short sticks, the heap of broken leaves, and the powder. "This powder we apply to the nose," and he and his companions took a pinch from the box and thrust it into their nostrils. Roger followed their example, but a pungent odor brought the tears into his eyes, and in another moment he was seized with a violent fit of sneezing, from which he was some time before he recovered. "You will get over this in time," the noble said gravely, but with a slight smile. "This effect is only experienced when the herb is first used." Much as Roger had been astonished by the effect of the powder, he was still more surprised at the use to which the broken leaf and the little sticks were put. 2 of the Mexicans filled the small bowls with the leaf, while the other took one of the tubes holding a small stick. An attendant then approached with a small piece of wood on fire. This was applied first to the stick and then to the small bowls, and to Roger's stupefaction great clouds of smoke at once issued from the mouths of the 3 Mexicans. Had it not been that, from the tranquil expression of their faces, he saw that this was the regular course of events, he would have thought that some accident had occurred, and that the Mexicans had, in some mysterious way, taken fire in the interior. He remained silent for a moment or 2, and then asked, "Do you like it? Is it really pleasant to you?" "It is indeed," the governor said. "This herb is largely used. Its effect is to produce a feeling of repose and contentment. You will get to like it in time." "Possibly I may," Roger replied, "although at present that hardly seems probable." The music now struck up a more lively air. Presently a number of young men and women, who had been feasting in another apartment, came in and performed several graceful dances, to the accompaniment of the music, singing, as they did so, a sort of chant, which reminded Roger of those he had so often heard in the churches at home. When all was over, the ambassadors withdrew, saying that doubtless their guests would wish to enjoy a siesta during the heat of the day. Some slaves led the way into another apartment, in which was a couch heaped with soft rugs, and here Roger threw himself down. "Was there ever an English boy in so strange a strait as mine?" he asked to himself. "What an extraordinary people! Gold seems as plentiful with them as common pottery with us, and as to the magnificence of their dresses, I verily believe that the court of King Harry would make but a poor show beside them. If I could land at Plymouth tomorrow, with all the presents I have received today, I should be a rich man. Here they are valueless. I received presents at first at Tabasco, and yet had I remained there a month longer, I should have been sacrificed to those cruel gods of theirs. These presents mean really nothing to me. They seem magnificent, but gold is so common here that it is no more than if, at home, one presented a man with necklaces of glass and some woolen cloths. It is a mark of civility, but that is all. When I get there, the priest will be inquiring into my religion, and when they see that I pay no honor to their gods, they will be sure to raise a cry against me." Malinche was telling me that every year some special prisoner is chosen for sacrifice, and is treated with great honor, and has every luxury until the time comes, and then they put him to death. Brutes! I have no doubt they will consider that, from my very rarity, I shall make a specially acceptable sacrifice. I wish I was back on the Hoe again. Cousin Diggory and Mistress Mercy and the girls little think into what a horrible fix I have fallen. Alone among a strange people, who breathe smoke out of their mouths, and load me with rich presents one day, and may kill me on the next. Well, when the day comes, I shall try not to disgrace my country, and religion, and color. But it is very hard, being all alone here. If I had but 2 or 3 of my companions of the Swan with me, I should feel that I could face whatever came. But it is hard to stand quite alone, and I am only a boy. Still, they shall find that I can strike a rough blow or two, before I die. They shall not find that it is a lamb that they are going to sacrifice, but a Devonshire lad, with such bone and muscle as one gets from a life on the sea. It is strange that these people should be so cruel. They seem so mild and so gentle, and yet Malinche says that they sacrifice tens of thousands of captives every year to their gods. They never kill in battle if they can avoid it, striving only to take their enemies prisoners for this horrible service. I must try, if I can, to make friends among them. The old cazique of Tabasco stood by me well, and it may be that here I may find some like him. But it will need a powerful protector, indeed, to stand against the priests, who, Malinche says, are far more powerful here than in Tabasco. 3 hours later an attendant came in, and said that the governor invited his guest to walk with him through the town, and survey the temples and other edifices. "Now for it," Roger said, clenching his fist. "Now, Roger Hawkshaw, you have got to show yourself a true man, whatever comes of it." He fastened the sword, which was one of the weapons with which he had been presented, to his girdle, and then went out into the great hall, from which all the other apartments opened. The governor and the 2 nobles from Tezcuco were awaiting him. Upon sallying out, Roger found that the streets were as crowded as when he entered. He was received with a long, quavering cry of welcome by the women, and by a deeper hum of applause by the men. All bent to the ground before him and his companions, before whom a party of soldiers moved to clear the way. "Now we will go first to the great temple," the governor said. "It is but small, in comparison with those of the great cities of the valley, but it is a very holy shrine, and numbers come from all the cities round to pay their devotion there on the days of festival." There are 40 temples in the town, on all of which fires burn night and day, but this is the largest and holiest of them. After passing through several streets, Roger saw a great hill rising in front of him. Whether it was the work of man, or had a natural hill for its foundation, he knew not. It was four-sided and pyramidal in form. There were terraces rising, one above the other, supported by stone walls. Steps at the angles led from one terrace to another, but these were so placed that anyone mounting had to pass right along the terrace round the pyramid before he arrived at the steps leading to that above. The top of the pyramid seemed to be cut off, leaving an area of, as far as he could judge, some 50 feet square. Smoke ascended from the summit, where, as Malinche had told him, fire always burns before the altar in its center. Just before reaching the foot of the pyramid, the governor pointed to a building of considerable size. "Here you will see," he said, leading Roger towards a great gateway, "how well the god has been honored." As he neared the gateway, Roger saw that the building was well nigh filled with an immense pile, carefully built up, of what at first appeared to him cannonballs, only of larger size than any he had seen piled in the batteries of Plymouth, and of a white color. Then the thought struck him that they were great turnips, or some such root, which might be held sacred to the god. But as he entered the building the truth flashed across him. The great pile was composed entirely of human skulls. Roger had made up his mind that, although he would not give way in the slightest in the matter of his faith, he would yet abstain from shocking the religious feeling of the natives. After the first involuntary start at the discovery, he silenced his feelings, and asked how many skulls there were in the heap. He could not, however, understand the reply, as he had not yet mastered the Aztec method of enumeration, which was a very complicated one. Roger walked along one side of the pile, counted the number of skulls in a line and the number of rows, and then tried to reckon how many skulls there were. Roger was not quick at figures, although his father had tried hard to teach him to calculate rapidly, as it was necessary for one who traded, and bought and sold goods of all descriptions, to be able to keep his own figures, or he would otherwise be forced always to carry a supercargo, as was indeed the custom in almost all trading ships, for there were few masters who could read and write, far less keep accounts. However, as he found there were 100 skulls in each line, and 10 rows, and as the heap was nearly square, it was not a difficult task to arrive at the conclusion that there must be 100,000 skulls in the pile. This seemed to him beyond belief, and yet he could arrive at no other conclusion. If 100,000 victims had been offered up, in one temple of this comparatively small city, what must be the total of men killed throughout the country? The pile had, no doubt, been a long time in growing, perhaps 100 years, but even then it would give 1,000 victims yearly in this one temple. Although it seemed well nigh impossible to Roger, it was yet by no means excessive, for according to the accounts of all historians, Mexican and Spanish, the number of victims slain annually on the altars of Mexico amounted to from 25 to 50,000. The god has good reason to be pleased? The Aztec ambassador, who was watching Roger's face closely, remarked. "If he is fond of blood and sacrifices, he should indeed be pleased," Roger said quietly. "But all gods do not love slaughter. Quetzalcoatl, your god of the air, he who loved men and taught them what they know, such a god would abhor sacrifices of blood. Offerings of fruit and flowers which he taught men to grow, of the arts in which he instructed them, would be vastly more pleasing to him than human victims." Roger spoke in a tone of authority, as if he were sure of what he stated. "When the white god left your shores, there were no human sacrifices offered to the gods. This fact Roger had learned from Malinche, who had told him that the custom had been introduced in comparatively late years. She said 10 generations, which he supposed would mean about 200 years, and such a custom would be abhorrent to him. The Aztec governor looked very grave. It was to the god of war that these sacrifices were offered, but the idea that the kindly white god, who stood next to him in public estimation, might not only object to be so worshipped himself, but might object altogether to human sacrifices being offered, was unpleasant to him. And yet this white stranger clearly spoke as if he were acquainted with the mind of Quetzalcoatl. The Tezcucan envoys, on the other hand, looked pleased. Tezcuco had maintained for a long time a milder form of worship. Her people were more gentle than the Aztecs, and had only reluctantly, and in part, adopted the terrible rites of their formidable neighbors. "Will you ascend the temple?" the governor asked. "No," said Roger firmly. "I say not aught against the god of battles. Let those who will make offerings to him. The god of the air," and Roger raised his hand towards the sky, "loves flowers and fruit and peace and goodwill. When he came down to earth, he preached peace, and would have had all men as brothers. And I, who follow him, will not bow down at altars where human beings have been sacrificed." The Mexican naturally thought that Roger was speaking of Quetzalcoatl, and this strange knowledge he possessed of the god and his ways and wishes struck him with deep awe. Without making any further attempt to induce him to ascend the teocalli, which was the name they gave to their pyramidal temples, the governor led the way back to the palace. The next morning Roger started with the Tezcucan envoys on his journey. They informed him on the way that the Aztec governor had, on the previous evening, dispatched an officer of high rank to Mexico, to give the emperor the full details of the conversation and sayings of the strange visitor; for the dispatches were available only for sending news of facts and occurrences, but could not be used as mediums for conveying thought. Montezuma is mild and gentle in his disposition, and quite unlike his 2 predecessors, who were mighty warriors, and doubtless in his heart he will welcome the words you said yesterday concerning Quetzalcoatl. But he is swayed wholly by the priests, and such sentiments will not be agreeable to them, for sacrifices are forever going on at the teocalli. At the dedication of the great temple for Huitzilopochtli, just 30 years ago, 70,000 captives were put to death. "They must have been miserable creatures," Roger said indignantly, "to have submitted tamely to such a fate. They might, at least, have rushed upon their guards, however numerous, and died fighting." Roger said little more during that day's journey. The admiration he had at first felt for the arts and civilization of these people had been succeeded by a feeling of abhorrence. He had heard, from Malinche, that all victims sacrificed to the gods were afterwards cooked and eaten; and although he had scarcely believed the girl, in spite of her solemn assurances, he could now, after seeing the vast pile of human skulls, quite believe that it was true. End of chapter 7.